The convenience store's fluorescent lights buzzed quietly in the background as a black BMW pulled into the parking lot. Behind the wheel sat a woman in blue scrubs, her hospital ID badge still clipped to her pocket after a long 12-hour shift in the neurosurgery department. Her dark curly hair was tied back in a neat bun, and despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She had stopped only to grab some milk and bread on her way home, a quick errand before she could finally rest. The store's security cameras silently recorded as she gathered her purse and stepped out of the vehicle, the motion-activated doors sliding open with a soft whoosh. The night was quiet, typical for this suburban neighborhood at 10 p.m. A patrol car rolled slowly through the parking lot just as she was locking her car. The officer inside watched her movements with unusual intensity, his spotlight suddenly illuminating her figure. "Ma'am, stay where you are," the officer called out, his voice carrying an edge that seemed unnecessary for the situation. He stepped out of his vehicle, one hand resting on his holster, a detail that didn't escape the doctor's notice. She remained perfectly still, her years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room helping her maintain composure. "Officer, is something wrong?" Her voice was steady and professional. The officer, whose nameplate read Officer P. Wilson, approached with an aggressive stance that seemed out of proportion for a routine stop. "We've had reports of drug activity in this area. You match a description we received." The doctor's eyebrows rose slightly. She was wearing hospital scrubs, still had her stethoscope around her neck, and her hospital ID clearly displayed her credentials. "Officer, I'm a neurosurgeon at Central Memorial. I just finished my shift and stopped to pick up some groceries. Here's my hospital ID." "I don't care what you're wearing," Wilson interrupted, his tone becoming more hostile. "Those could be fake. Where were you really coming from? What's in that purse?" She took a deep breath, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Sir, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm a respected physician who's just worked a 12-hour shift saving lives. You can call the hospital to verify my identity. My name is—" The sharp sound of skin hitting skin echoed through the parking lot as Officer Wilson's hand struck her face, the force causing her to stumble backward. The security cameras captured everything. The unprovoked slap, the look of shock on her face, and the officer's aggressive posture. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. Other customers who had witnessed the incident stood shocked, phones already recording. The store clerk pressed his face against the window, his hand reaching for the phone to call 911. The doctor touched her cheek, her medical training automatically cataloging the symptoms: sharp pain, possible contusion forming, slight taste of blood where her lip had caught against her teeth. But more than the physical pain, there was the humiliation, the injustice, the sheer abuse of power playing out in this quiet parking lot. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone. Officer Wilson tensed, but she spoke with remarkable calm. "I'm calling my husband now. He works for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Civil Rights Division. I suggest you step back." Wilson's face flickered with the first signs of uncertainty, but he maintained his aggressive stance. "Are you threatening me?" "No, Officer Wilson. I'm informing you of the consequences of your actions. Everything that just happened is on camera, and multiple witnesses are recording right now. I'm a professional who stopped for groceries, and you just assaulted me without provocation." She dialed her husband's number, maintaining eye contact with the officer. Her voice was steady as she spoke into the phone. "Hey, I need you to come to the quick stop on Oak Street. An Officer Wilson just assaulted me during an unwarranted stop. Yes, there's video. Yes, there are witnesses." The change in Wilson's demeanor was subtle but noticeable. The hand that had been resting on his holster dropped to his side. The aggressive stance softened slightly. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his face as the reality of his actions began to sink in. More customers had gathered now, their phones recording everything. The store clerk had emerged from behind his counter, holding the store's security footage ready on a USB drive. He'd seen enough incidents in his years behind the counter to know this evidence needed to be preserved. "You can't do anything to me," Wilson said, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. "I was responding to a suspicious person report." "Officer," she replied, her professional calm never wavering, "in the next few minutes, several things are going to happen. My husband's team will arrive. They will take statements from these witnesses. They will collect this video evidence. And then a process will begin that has nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. True to her word, within minutes, multiple unmarked federal vehicles pulled into the parking lot. Her husband stepped out of the lead car, wearing a suit despite the late hour. His FBI badge caught the store's fluorescent lights as he approached. Wilson's face had lost all color now. The reality of his situation was becoming clear. This wasn't going to be another incident swept under the rug by internal affairs. This wasn't going to disappear with a few friendly phone calls. This was about to become a federal civil rights investigation. In just 3 minutes, his entire world had changed. Not because of personal revenge, but because he had finally assaulted someone with the power and position to hold him accountable through proper legal channels. The doctor stood tall, her cheek reddening but her dignity intact. As she watched federal agents begin their preliminary investigation, she realized this incident would become more than just another statistic. It would become a catalyst for change, a moment when the system actually worked as it was supposed to. The convenience store's security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing the beginning of what would become a landmark case in police accountability. All because one officer couldn't see past his prejudices, and one doctor knew exactly how to respond, not with violence, but with justice. As customers continued recording on their phones, nobody said a word. The only sounds were the quiet professionalism of federal agents beginning their work, the hum of the store's lights, and Officer Wilson being read his rights, not by an angry husband seeking revenge, but by federal agents following proper procedure. Sometimes, the most powerful response to injustice isn't a dramatic act of revenge. Sometimes, it's simply knowing how to make the system work as it should. And that night, at a simple convenience store, justice was about to be served the right way. The phone call lasted exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds. In that brief span, everything changed. The FBI agent's voice remained steady as his wife described the assault, but his knuckles turned white around the steering wheel of his bureau-issued vehicle. He was already turning his car around before she finished speaking. Years of training kicked in automatically. He logged the call officially, activated his vehicle's GPS tracking, and notified his team with calm efficiency. But beneath that professional exterior, his mind was racing through federal statutes, civil rights violations, and the long history of similar incidents that had gone unpunished. Send the nearest units to the location, he instructed his team through the secure radio. Full documentation protocol. I want every witness statement, every angle of video, everything by the book. His voice never wavered. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Back at the convenience store, the doctor was handling things with remarkable composure. She'd grabbed paper and pen from her purse and was quietly collecting contact information from witnesses. Her medical training helped her maintain a clinical detachment, even as her cheek throbbed where the officer had struck her. The young store clerk, still holding the USB drive with security footage, approached her nervously. I saw everything, he said, his voice shaking slightly. I'd worked here 3 years, and I've seen that officer hassle people before, but never like this. The cameras caught all of it, from when you pulled up to when he hit you. She thanked him quietly, noting his name and contact information. Her years in the emergency room had taught her the importance of documenting everything. The security system, she asked, does it capture audio as well as video? The clerk nodded eagerly. Full HD with sound. We had it upgraded last month after a robbery. It's crystal clear. You can even read his nameplate in the footage. Officer Wilson stood by his patrol car, radioing frantically to his supervisor. His earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by growing panic as he realized the gravity of his situation. This wasn't going to be handled with a friendly chat in the captain's office. This was federal territory now. Other customers had gathered in small groups, their phones still recording. The story was already spreading across social media. One witness, a retired judge, was quietly explaining to others the significance of federal agents taking over the scene. This isn't just about one bad officer anymore, he told them. This is about systemic accountability. 3 minutes after the initial call, the first unmarked federal vehicles pulled into the parking lot. The agents who stepped out weren't acting on emotion. They moved with the precision of professionals who knew exactly how to handle civil rights violations. They secured the scene, began interviewing witnesses, and most importantly, ensured all video evidence was properly preserved. The FBI agent arrived moments later. His wife watched as he walked past her without a word, heading straight for Officer Wilson. There was no confrontation, no dramatic showdown. Instead, he simply began reading the officer his rights in a clear, steady voice. This wasn't personal anymore. This was federal law enforcement in action. "You have the right to remain silent," he recited, each word crisp and professional. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The words echoed across the parking lot, carrying the weight of justice finally being served. The store's security cameras continued their silent vigil, recording as more federal agents arrived. They documented everything: the growing crowd of witnesses, the local police supervisor arriving to find his authority superseded, and most importantly, the steady, professional way the FBI team handled the situation. Inside the store, 2 agents were already reviewing the security footage. The crystal-clear video showed the entire incident from multiple angles. There would be no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The evidence was irrefutable. The doctor sat in an agent's car, giving her statement. Her voice remained steady as she recounted every detail: her hospital shift, stopping for groceries, the officer's approach, his escalating aggression, and the moment of the assault. She described everything with the same precision she used when dictating surgical notes. On the other side of the parking lot, Officer Wilson's supervisor had arrived, looking flustered and angry. He demanded to know why his officer was being detained by federal agents. The FBI agent's response was simple and direct. "This is now a federal civil rights investigation. Your department will receive official notification within the hour." The supervisor's face fell as he realized the implications. This wasn't going to be handled internally. This wasn't going to disappear into the bureaucratic maze of internal affairs. This was federal territory now, and nothing would stop the wheels of justice from turning. As midnight approached, the convenience store parking lot had transformed into a full federal crime scene. Evidence technicians photographed the area where the assault occurred. Agents conducted careful interviews with each witness. The store's security footage was being downloaded and authenticated. The doctor watched it all unfold with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Her shift at the hospital seemed like a lifetime ago, but she knew this night would have consequences far beyond her throbbing cheek. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. This was about changing a system. In just 3 minutes, a routine stop had transformed into something much bigger. The security cameras kept recording, capturing every detail of proper procedure in action. This wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of justice being served the right way, by the book, without drama or violence. As federal agents continued their methodical work, the night air was filled with the quiet sounds of justice in motion: radio calls, camera shutters, witness statements being recorded. This was how real change happened, not with shouting or violence, but with careful documentation and unwavering adherence to the law. The FBI's Civil Rights Division office buzzed with focused energy the next morning. Agents moved with purpose, sorting through evidence collected from the convenience store incident. The wall-mounted screens displayed multiple angles of the security footage, each showing the assault in crystal-clear detail. The lead FBI agent sat at his desk, reviewing witness statements. His tie was loosened slightly. He hadn't gone home last night, working straight through to ensure everything was handled properly. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion, but his focus never wavered. "You need to see this," called one of the tech analysts, waving him over to a computer screen. "I've been going through Officer Wilson's bodycam footage from the past 6 months. There's a pattern." The screen showed dozens of traffic stops, each involving minorities, each escalating unnecessarily. The footage painted a clear picture of systematic harassment, but none had resulted in formal complaints. The agent leaned closer, studying the dates and times. "Pull his dispatch records," he instructed. "I want to know how many of these stops were based on actual calls versus his own initiative." His voice remained professional, but there was an edge of determination in it. Across town, the police department was in chaos. The chief had arrived early to find federal agents already there, serving warrants for personnel files and internal investigation records. The usually quiet hallways were filled with activity as agents methodically worked their way through years of documentation. "We've cooperated with internal affairs investigations before," the chief protested, watching helplessly as agents boxed up files. "This isn't an internal affairs matter anymore," responded the senior agent present. "This is a federal civil rights investigation. We have evidence of systematic civil rights violations spanning multiple years." Back at the FBI office, more evidence was pouring in. The convenience store footage had gone viral overnight, prompting other victims to come forward. The agent's phone hadn't stopped ringing, each call bringing new testimonies, new evidence, new patterns of abuse. A young agent rushed in with a stack of papers. "We found something in the department's internal communications. Every time someone filed a complaint against Wilson, it was routed to the same supervisor. That supervisor buried every single report." The lead agent nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. "Cross-reference that supervisor's personnel files with Wilson's. I want to know if there's any connection between them." The investigation was expanding beyond a single incident of assault. Layer by layer, they were uncovering a network of protection that had allowed this behavior to continue unchecked for years. In the break room, agents gathered around a TV showing local news coverage. The convenience store incident was the lead story, but the focus wasn't on violence or revenge. Instead, reporters were discussing police accountability and the role of federal oversight in civil rights cases. The doctor appeared on screen, speaking at a hastily organized press conference. Her face showed the bruising from the assault, but her voice was strong and clear. "This isn't about one incident or one officer," she stated. "This is about ensuring our law enforcement system works for everyone, regardless of who they are." Back at his desk, the lead agent received a call from the Department of Justice. They were taking a special interest in the case, seeing it as an opportunity to address systemic issues in law enforcement accountability. "We're sending additional resources," the DOJ official said. "This case could set important precedents for handling civil rights violations by law enforcement officers." The agent hung up and looked around his office. Every surface was covered with evidence: witness statements, video footage, personnel files. But unlike many similar cases, this one wouldn't be brushed aside or lost in bureaucratic limbo. By late afternoon, the investigation had expanded to include 3 other officers who had helped cover up Wilson's previous incidents. The web of corruption was larger than anyone had initially suspected, but now it was being exposed through careful, methodical police work. In the forensics lab, technicians were analyzing the audio from the convenience store footage. Every word was being transcribed, every action documented. There would be no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The store's security system was better than most banks, one tech commented, adjusting his headphones. "You can hear everything," including Wilson radioing for backup before he even approached her car. He was planning to escalate from the start. The lead agent stood in the doorway of the tech lab, watching the footage play again. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about something much bigger, about changing a system that had protected bad actors for too long. As evening approached, he finally took a moment to call his wife. Her voice was stronger now, the shock of the previous night replaced by determination. "How are you handling it?" she asked, knowing how personal this case was for him. "By the book," he replied. "Everything by the book. That's how we make real change." And he meant it. Because sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't dramatic action, it's careful, methodical pursuit of justice through proper channels. The office remained busy late into the night. Agents continued building their case, piece by piece, evidence by evidence. This wasn't just about one assault anymore, it was about fixing a broken system, and they would do it the right way. The investigation room at the FBI office had transformed into a command center. Evidence boards covered every wall, connected by red strings showing patterns of misconduct. 3 days had passed since the convenience store incident, and what started as a single assault case had ballooned into something much bigger. The lead FBI agent stood before the main board, coffee cup in hand, studying a timeline of events. Each pin represented a complaint against Officer Wilson, but now they were seeing connections to other officers, other precincts, other incidents that had been systematically buried. "Chief," called a young analyst from her computer station, "you need to see these emails." She pulled up a series of messages on the main screen. They were using code words to flag certain types of stops. Look at the pattern. The emails revealed a disturbing system. Officers were marking certain traffic stops with specific phrases, ensuring these incidents would be routed to supervisors who would make them disappear. It wasn't just one bad officer anymore, it was an organized network. The door burst open as another agent rushed in. "We found something in the financial records," he announced, spreading papers across the conference table. 3 of the supervisors involved in burying complaints were receiving regular payments from a private security company. The lead agent picked up one of the documents, his eyes narrowing. The same security company that provides training to half the precincts in the state. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about police misconduct anymore, it was about systemic corruption. Meanwhile, at the police department, internal affairs officers watched helplessly as federal agents continued their investigation. Years of carefully buried incidents were being unearthed, each one adding to the growing picture of corruption. "Look at these training records," one FBI analyst pointed out. Every officer involved in misconduct incidents attended the same special training sessions, but these sessions don't appear in the official department curriculum. The lead agent's phone buzzed. Another victim had come forward. This time, a former police officer who had tried to report misconduct years ago. He had been forced to resign after filing complaints about Officer Wilson's behavior. "I tried to speak up," the former officer explained during his interview. "But they made my life hell. Dangerous assignments, no backup when I called for it, constant harassment. Eventually, I got the message and quit." In the tech lab, analysts were piecing together body camera footage from dozens of incidents. The pattern was clear: cameras mysteriously malfunctioning during certain stops, footage being marked as corrupted, reports being filed with key details missing. "They were smart about it," one tech explained, pointing to her screen. "They never completely deleted anything that would be too obvious. They just made sure the important parts were always somehow damaged or unreadable." The doctor's case had opened a floodgate. More victims were coming forward every day, each story adding another piece to the puzzle. But unlike before, these stories weren't being buried or ignored. Each one was carefully documented, investigated, and added to the growing federal case. Late that evening, the lead agent received a call from the Department of Justice. "This is bigger than we thought," the DOJ official said. "We're seeing similar patterns in other departments. Your case might have uncovered something nationwide." The agent looked at his evidence board, now expanded to cover 3 walls. Red strings connected incidents, officers, supervisors, and training programs. What had started with one act of brutality had revealed a complex web of systemic corruption. In the break room, agents watched more news coverage. The story had gone national, but not as a sensational tale of revenge. Instead, reporters were diving deep into police accountability, civilian oversight, and the role of federal investigations in reforming law enforcement. The doctor had become an unexpected symbol of the investigation. Her professional demeanor and calm insistence on proper procedure resonated with people. She wasn't calling for violence or revenge. She was demanding accountability through legal channels. Back in the investigation room, the lead agent pinned another document to the board. This one showed connections between police training programs and private security companies across multiple states. Each connection represented another thread in the web of corruption they were uncovering. "This is how change happens," he told his team, standing before the evidence board. "Not through revenge or violence, but through careful investigation and proper procedure. We're not just building a case anymore, we're exposing a system that needs to change." The room hummed with activity as agents continued their work. This wasn't about one officer slapping one doctor anymore. This was about reforming a system that had protected bad actors for far too long, and they would do it the right way, with evidence, documentation, and unwavering commitment to justice. The police department's internal affairs office felt different now. Gone were the usual sounds of paperwork being quietly filed away. Instead, the space buzzed with activity as federal oversight forced real investigation into years of buried complaints. The internal affairs captain sat at his desk, staring at a stack of files he could no longer ignore. Each folder contained complaints against Officer Wilson and his associates, complaints that should have been investigated years ago. The federal presence in his office left no room for the usual tactics of delay and dismissal. "The FBI team wants these files reviewed by end of day," his assistant said, adding another stack to his desk. "They're especially interested in the cases from last summer." Her voice carried a note of satisfaction. She'd watched too many valid complaints get buried over the years. Across the hall, two internal affairs investigators huddled over a computer, reviewing dashcam footage with new eyes. "We missed this," one said quietly. "Or maybe we chose not to see it." The footage showed a pattern that was now impossible to ignore: selective enforcement, escalated stops, systematic harassment. The office printer hummed continuously, spitting out report after report. Years of buried incidents were being resurrected, each one adding to the growing picture of departmental failure. Officers who had once felt untouchable now walked the halls with nervous expressions. "Another officer wants to speak with the FBI," an investigator announced, handing up his phone. "Says he has information about the training programs Officer Wilson ran." The room fell quiet. Wilson's influence in the department's training division had been extensive. In the break room, officers gathered in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. The old guard looked worried, while younger officers seemed almost relieved. The wall of silence was crumbling, and with it, the pressure to stay quiet about misconduct. A young officer approached the internal affairs desk, hands shaking slightly. "I have something you should see," she said, placing a personal notebook on the desk. "I've been keeping records of everything I saw during my probationary period. Things that didn't seem right." Her notebook detailed incidents, dates, names, a rookie's careful documentation of a system she knew was wrong, but had felt powerless to challenge. Now, with federal oversight forcing real investigation, her evidence would finally matter. The police chief paced in his office, watching federal agents box up more files. His department's dirty laundry was being aired, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The convenience store incident had triggered an avalanche of accountability. "Sir," his secretary interrupted, "the media is asking for comment on the training program investigation." The chief sank into his chair. The training programs had been his pride and joy. Now they were being revealed as a tool for spreading bad practices. In the detective division, veteran officers watched as their younger colleagues stepped forward one by one, each sharing stories they'd kept quiet about for years. The old excuses, "That's just how things are," or "You don't understand how it works," held no power anymore. The internal affairs captain called an emergency meeting. "Every complaint gets investigated now," he announced to his team. "Every single one. No more buried files, no more looking the other way. The feds aren't leaving until we prove we can do our jobs properly." Outside in the parking lot, a local news crew interviewed officers leaving their shifts. The story wasn't about one incident anymore. It was about a department being forced to confront years of systematic failures. "It's like a weightlifting," one officer told the camera. "We all knew things weren't right, but speaking up meant risking everything. Now, staying quiet is the bigger risk." Back inside, internal affairs investigators worked late into the night. They weren't just going through motions anymore. They were doing real investigations, asking hard questions, following evidence wherever it led. The doctor's assault case had become a catalyst for change, but not through violence or revenge. Instead, it had cracked open the door for real accountability, and now that door couldn't be closed. As midnight approached, the Internal Affairs Office remained lit and active. Files were being reviewed, statements taken, evidence logged properly. The federal presence had forced them to do what they should have been doing all along, their actual jobs. The system wasn't changing because of dramatic confrontations or acts of revenge. It was changing because one incident had shone a light on years of misconduct, and now that light couldn't be switched off. Real change was happening, one properly investigated complaint at a time. The federal courthouse buzzed with anticipation. 2 weeks had passed since the convenience store incident, and now Officer Wilson sat at the defendant's table, his police uniform replaced by a civilian suit. The transformation from confident officer to nervous defendant was striking. The prosecutor stood before the jury, her voice clear and confident. "This case isn't just about one slap," she began. "It's about a pattern of behavior that went unchecked for years. Today, we'll show you evidence of systematic civil rights violations that can no longer be ignored." The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage from the convenience store played on multiple screens, showing the unprovoked assault from every angle. The crystal-clear audio captured every word, leaving no room for alternative interpretations. But this was just the beginning. Hour after hour, witness after witness took the stand. Former victims spoke about similar encounters, their voices steady as they described years of harassment and abuse. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The doctor sat in the gallery, watching as the justice system did its work. Her bruises had faded, but her determination hadn't. She listened as tech experts explained how body camera footage had been systematically altered, how complaints had been buried, how the whole system had been rigged to protect officers who abused their power. "Look at this training manual," the prosecutor said, holding up a thick binder. "Officer Wilson helped design these programs. See how they teach officers to escalate situations unnecessarily, to create confrontations where none need to exist." The jury leaned forward, examining documents that showed how deep the corruption went. Financial records revealed payments between training companies and police supervisors. Internal emails exposed codes used to flag certain types of stops. A former rookie officer testified about the pressure to conform. "They told us this was how real police work was done," she explained. "If we spoke up, we were labeled as troublemakers. Our careers would be over before they began." The lead FBI agent presented his findings, his testimony precise and professional. He walked the jury through years of evidence, showing how one officer's actions connected to a larger pattern of departmental misconduct. During cross-examination, Wilson's defense tried to paint him as a victim of the system, but the evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear. Email after email, report after report, showed conscious choices to abuse power and hide misconduct. The courthouse camera caught it all. The parade of witnesses, the mounting evidence, the slow crumbling of the blue wall of silence. This wasn't a story of revenge. It was a story of justice being served through proper channels. In the gallery, other police officers watched the proceedings. Some looked uncomfortable, others relieved. The message was clear. The old ways of doing things were over. Accountability was no longer optional. The police chief testified about department policies, squirming as prosecutors revealed how those policies had been systematically ignored. His testimony showed a leadership that had chosen convenience over accountability, silence over justice. News cameras outside captured a growing crowd of supporters, not angry protesters, but citizens demanding accountability through legal means. They carried signs calling for police reform, for civilian oversight, for real change. Inside, the trial continued. Expert witnesses explained how proper police procedure should work, highlighting how far Wilson and his associates had strayed from those standards. Each testimony added another brick to the wall of evidence. The doctor's own testimony was powerful in its simplicity. She described the incident without anger or dramatics, her professional demeanor underlining the absurdity of Wilson's actions. Her husband watched from the gallery, not as an angry spouse, but as a federal agent who had done his job properly. As closing arguments approached, the courthouse hallways filled with whispered conversations about change. Other departments were already reviewing their policies, knowing this case would set new precedents for accountability. The prosecutor stood for her closing statement. "This isn't just about punishing one officer," she told the jury. "This is about sending a message that no one is above the law, that a badge doesn't grant immunity from accountability." The evidence boards stood in the courtroom, covered with photos, documents, and connections that couldn't be ignored. What had started as one incident had exposed a system that needed fundamental change. This was justice in action, not through violence or revenge, but through the patient, methodical application of law. The system wasn't perfect, but when used properly, it could work as intended. 1 year later, the police department looked very different. The old guard had been replaced, not through dramatic firings, but through the quiet power of accountability. Officer Wilson's conviction had set off a chain reaction that transformed not just one department, but law enforcement across the state. The new training center buzzed with activity. Instead of the old programs that taught escalation and confrontation, new officers learned about de-escalation and community engagement. The instructor, a former civil rights attorney, walked her class through proper procedures. "Remember," she told the cadets, "your body cameras are your protection. They don't just record civilians, they record your professionalism, your good judgment, your service to the community. The Civilian Oversight Board met in what used to be the Internal Affairs Office. Community members reviewed body camera footage alongside officers, discussing what went right and what could be improved. The us versus them mentality was fading, replaced by genuine collaboration. The doctor who had been assaulted now served on this board. Her experience had transformed her from victim to advocate, but not in the way many expected. She pushed for better training, for clearer accountability, for systems that prevented abuse rather than just punished it. In the dispatch center, new protocols were in place. Every stop was logged with multiple identifiers, making it impossible to hide selective enforcement. Computer systems flagged unusual patterns automatically, ensuring no officer could build up a hidden record of misconduct. The FBI agent who had led the investigation now conducted training sessions for other departments. He shared how one properly handled case had uncovered systemic issues and how addressing those issues had made everyone safer, officers and civilians alike. Officer Wilson watched these changes from his prison cell. His 5-year sentence wasn't just punishment, it was a message that accountability applied to everyone. His case had become required reading in police academies, a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing power. The convenience store where it all started had become something of a landmark. The owner had framed the security camera footage still that captured the moment, not to celebrate violence, but to remind everyone that justice could work when people stood up the right way. In the Police Academy library, a new case study section had been created. Cadets studied how proper procedure and documentation had brought real change. They learned that good policing wasn't about power or force, it was about service and accountability. The doctor's hospital ID still hung around her neck as she entered the oversight board meeting. She had kept her day job, performing surgeries and saving lives. But now she also helped save something else, the relationship between police and community. Local news crews gathered outside the department for the 1-year anniversary of the changes. They weren't reporting on protests or confrontations. Instead, they covered statistics showing dramatic improvements in community relations and officer conduct. The department's new chief, a reformer brought in after the trial, stood at the podium. "A year ago, we learned a hard lesson," she told the cameras, "but we learned it the right way, through proper channels, through legal procedure, through systematic change." Inside the station, the wall that once held officer commendations now displayed the department's new standards and accountability metrics. Monthly stats showed response times, civilian complaints, and resolution rates, all open to public review. The FBI agent's office had returned to normal operations, but a photo on his wall showed the evidence board from Wilson's case. It reminded him that real change didn't come from dramatic confrontations. It came from patient, professional police work. As evening fell, a patrol car pulled into the same convenience store parking lot where everything had started. The officer inside wore a new type of body camera, one that couldn't be turned off or tampered with. She greeted customers with respect, knowing every interaction was a chance to prove that change was real. The doctor drove past the store on her way home from a late shift. The bruises had long faded, but the impact of that night remained, not as trauma, but as transformation. One incident of injustice had sparked real reform, not through revenge, but through the proper use of justice.